It all started when we moved out of our old house. We were not really keen on moving at first place, but we didn't have much option but to do so. We rented out a place in Florence, and we were the only English people in the town, so the cultural differences seemed to be pretty inflated by the time we set ourselves in the new rental place. Our stay was only for a month, and then we were headed back to London. We had no idea where everything in this new place was and where we can get stuff from. So we decided to cruise around the town in our bikes, and as we did, I met Malcolm. Malcolm was my first friend that I made in that place, and my only friend. He was also on his bike the first day he met me, and he took me to the local market and helped me shop easily. And then on the way back, we saw this really cool house that was all done for and broken, and then Malcolm told me that this house is off limits. No one enters or exits the house, and that it was breeding house of pure evil. I found that amusing. 21st century, and then there were these people who believed in ghosts, and I assumed, but Malcolm was very persistent of the stories that he had heard, and said that he would not dare and be that rebellious. And that was enough to pique my curiosity about that house. Every day we would ride past the house, and I would just look into and observe the ways to get into the house, and at the moment, I used to get highly obsessed with finding the answers for the stuff and would do everything possible to get the curiosity at peace. I told Malcolm about my plan to get into the house and investigate. He called me crazy, refused to help me, snitched it to my parents, and stopped talking to me. The town was really scared of the house, and for some reason, my parents were too, and they grounded me. But me being me, I knew I could not be stopped. One night I got out of the window, took my bike and went to look it for myself and see for myself the horror everyone described. I got inside the house. It was dark and it seemed scary at first. There were not much movements that can be detected and everything seems untouchable. Apparently, stories involved a clown like Pennywise haunting the house and was linked to the deaths of all the missing children that walked into the house and were found face down in the quarry next morning, so everyone was scared. I knew the story, but I wasn't scared. I was intrigued. As I walked through the house, I found that there was nothing out of context and scary. As I walked with the torch in my hand and bag on my shoulder, a glove hand grabbed me. And as the hand grabbed me, my instinct kicked in and I turned off the flashlight. And as I did, I made sure to grip it tight and keep my hands free. I managed to open my mouth and give a fierce bite to his finger. He was down and in pain, and I kept biting as he shrieked. That shriek was as human as one gets, and as he dropped me, I get myself in balance and then looked at him with the flashlight. It was a creepy man in a mask. I turned off the flashlight and hit him hard across his face. He was down screaming in pain and also angry at the same time. I made a run for the door, but it was closed. I looked for the ways through flashlight and then switched it off. I was using it on a needed basis and finding out ways. I slid through the hall, and as I did, I knew he was following me. I turned on the flashlight and he tried to block the light hitting his eyes, and then I took a picture of him. I ran upstairs and quickly messaged the picture to my dad and 5 others in my phone, with this in the message: "Haunted house, creepy man, I am being attacked." I kept myself hidden in a room where he cannot find me, and I was listening to his steps approaching towards the room. It was dark and not easy to just walk around, but for him, it was easy. 5 minutes in, I felt he was approaching me, and he finally grabbed me, took the flashlight off my hands, and as I was trying to hit him, he started dragging me towards a room and opened a door that seemed to open towards the basement. But then sirens wailing on, he knew it was over. He left me there, punched me real hard, and started running down the basement saying that he will be back for me. As the police barged in, I directed them to the basement, and the man was caught an hour later. I was in trouble. The police, parents, Malcolm, and the whole town seemed to be angry with me, until the next day when I was lauded a hero when I exposed the creep pedophile shut-in who lured kids inside his house and then molested them and murdered them and threw them in the quarry that had the underground way from his basement. And that was the first time that I covered the story on my own in a local newspaper. From the local newspaper to New York Times crime unit, my adventures have just started. Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so. No one knew where it came from. We all went to sleep the night before, and it was there the next morning. Not even the owners of the house on both sides had a clue how it got there. Neither homeowner ever heard as much as the hiss of air brakes. During the whole of that night, the only real indication of how it arrived was the trailer was sitting upon. I was still relatively young at the time, around 13, but the subject was a hot topic around the neighborhood, and every person I spoke to, whether a kid or an adult, was eager to talk about it. Our neighborhood was somewhere new and off by itself, and it wasn't out of the ordinary for folks to dump things out there. Dogs and cats were the most common, but 1 or 2 cars would turn up every year. A house, though, no one ever seen that or expected it. The days passed, but no information could be gotten from anywhere. Soon, it began to take on a spooky and haunted reputation. Along with its phantom like a rival in the dark of the night, it did look a little familiar to that house from Psycho. The stories first reached me while I was talking to a friend's younger brother. Among the grade school kids, the house was becoming a very real symbol of fear, although it was just an old empty house to me. This fear didn't prevent some of the more adventurous of them just entering and exploring it. I witnessed a particularly funny episode just by chance. While loafing aimlessly around the streets, I was passing by in time to see a preteen boy running from the house in terror, claiming that something had grabbed him. Whether his imagination had gotten the best of him, or an older kid was having a bit of fun, the horror put upon this abandoned house had fully taken root in the neighborhood. While this was going on, a real boogeyman had been forgotten about. I'll not put his actual name here, not because of privacy, but that of the victims. We'll call him Rudy. Rudy had grown up in the neighborhood, and until he was arrested, was well liked by a lot of the parents, had voiced their fears early on because of his habit of hanging around younger boys. When he was released from jail, he was allowed to move in with his folks. Anyone who wasn't aware of his proclivities beforehand knew now every parent in the neighborhood watched him closely. But when the ghost house popped up, people's focus is shifted. A few of us teenagers were riding our bikes around the neighborhood. The father of a boy we'll call Bill was looking for a son. I overheard him speaking to a young kid close by, asking if he had seen him. Nonchalantly, the boy said that he had seen Bill going into that ghost house with Rudy just a few minutes prior. And this got my full attention. The shock of the father's face is still crystal clear in my mind. I turned around and watched the father run full speed into the house. Most of us there stood transfixed as we saw Bill's dad disappear inside. Things were quiet for about the first 30 seconds. Then, all of a sudden, a loud ruckus broke out, followed by Rudy flying out of the doorway and onto the ground below. Billy's dad was close behind. He leapt onto Rudy, throwing fists as he landed. Bill came out a few seconds later crying for his dad to stop. His dad ignored him, standing up and kicking Rudy to the ground over and over. Rudy eventually got to his feet and ran for home. Billy and his dad were right behind him. I continued to watch until they disappeared from my sight. Billy and Rudy would both claim later on that nothing had happened between them. Either way, Billy's dad had the support of most of the community, and Rudy declined to press charges on him. Rudy would eventually move away and out of the minds of most of us, until he was arrested 3 years later for abducting and killing 2 boys near his new home. Only then did we realize how lucky Bill had been. That night, as I'd fallen asleep, I remember wondering what was going to happen to Rudy and Bill's dad. When I woke up, things were normal for a summer morning. Around 9, I was making a bowl of cereal when I got a phone call. It was a friend of mine, and he was short of breath and excited. The ghost house. It's gone, man. I hung up and hopped on my bike. When I arrived at the end of the streets, I looked down and saw the empty lot as it used to be. I rode down to it, and a small group were gathering, talking to the neighbors. It was much the same as the morning when it appeared. They hadn't heard or seen anything strange. It seemed to leave just as silently as it had arrived. To this day, I haven't met a soul who knows anything about that house. Sometimes I think I dreamt the whole thing up. But then I speak to an old friend from the neighborhood, and my memories are confirmed. Of course, I don't believe it was haunted or anything like that, but I know for sure that something was wrong about it. And I pray that I never see it again. The main incident that occurred was also witnessed by my boyfriend, had happened in our child's room. For context, our 4-year-old son's room is located directly across the hall from my room, and we can see it from our bed. In my son's room, there are some jackets hanging up on some hooks on the back of his door. This is a detail that comes up later in the story. We've lived in this house for about 3 years and never had something like this happen before. So we're sitting in bed on our phones getting ready to go to sleep when we both hear our son jump out of bed and run across a room to the door. His door is like halfway shut, so I can see into the room. But as I looked up, I saw the door move like he bumped into it. My boyfriend jumps up to go put our son back to bed. After a minute or so, my boyfriend comes back out the room, looking kind of freaked out, and whispers he's fast asleep. He didn't get out of bed. I walked out of bed thinking my son is just pretending to be asleep or something, and walk in to see him definitely asleep, breathing slow under the covers how we tucked him in earlier. My boyfriend and I are both kind of like, what, to each other, wondering what just happened. We sort of just settled back into bed when something that makes this so much weirder happens maybe a half hour later. My son wakes up whimpering, and we get to go check on him. He's pointing at the door where the jackets are hanging, saying this monster's playing with my jacket. I flip on the light and look around. I can't see anything. My first thought was maybe some sort of animal got into our house, and that's when we heard what he just saw. So I look around the room trying to see if there's a mouse or something. Our house is already small and clean, so there's not many places for an animal to hide, and I can't find anything. Plus, my son keeps insisting the monster was still behind the door playing with his jacket. Additionally, the footsteps we heard were pretty loud and really sounded like my son, so it just didn't make sense that there was such a small animal. My son wouldn't go back to sleep alone, so my boyfriend laid down with him so he would feel safe. This was such an odd event. My son never talked about monsters or being scared before this. It was so out of nowhere and so weird that we heard the footsteps as well. Ever since then, my son will sometimes wake up crying, talking about a monster in his room. I wish I could find an explanation for what we heard. If we hadn't heard the footsteps, I would have probably dismissed my son's monster claims and not think much about them. Any ideas of what we could do or any rational explanation?